The morning sun filtered through the classroom windows as students practiced their musical scales. The gentle sounds of piano keys and young voices filled room 143 of Franklin High School. Their teacher, a tall man with kind eyes and graying temples, moved between the rows, nodding encouragingly as his students prepared for the upcoming spring concert. He had been teaching music for over 12 years, touching countless young lives with his passion for harmony and rhythm. Just last week, his advanced choir had won the state championships, and the trophy sat proudly on his desk, catching the morning light. That ordinary Tuesday in October started like any other. The autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the school courtyard, and the hallways buzzed with teenage chatter. His first period class was working on a particularly challenging piece when heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. The classroom door burst open with such force that a young student dropped her sheet music. 3 police officers entered, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. The teacher stood frozen by the piano, confusion written across his face as 25 pairs of teenage eyes darted between him and the officers. "Sir, please step away from the students," one officer commanded, his hand resting on his holster. The teacher raised his hands slowly, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly, conscious of his trembling students watching the scene unfold. But there was no mistake in their minds. They had a warrant, they said. They were investigating a violent robbery that had occurred at a convenience store 3 nights ago. According to them, an eyewitness had identified him as the perpetrator. The absurdity of the accusation might have been almost laughable if it weren't so terrifying. 3 nights ago, he had been directing the school concert, standing before hundreds of parents and students in the auditorium. Dozens of people could verify his whereabouts. As the officers led him out, his students stood in shocked silence. One brave sophomore called out, "But he was with us at the concert." Others joined in, their voices rising in protest, but the officers continued their grim procession down the hallway. Through the school's glass doors, he could see news vans already gathering in the parking lot. How had they arrived so quickly? His heart sank as he thought of his elderly mother watching this on the evening news. She had already lost his father last year. How would she handle this? In the back of the police car, he sat straight-backed, dignified despite the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The teacher in him wanted to stay calm, to set an example even now. But his mind was spinning with questions. How could someone identify him for a crime he didn't commit? Why hadn't the police checked his alibi before storming into his classroom? The convenience store in question was on the other side of town, in a neighborhood he'd never visited. The robbery had happened at 8:30 p.m., exactly when he had been conducting the finale of the school concert. There would be videos, photographs, hundreds of witnesses. This would all be cleared up quickly, he told himself. But as the police car pulled away from the school he'd served faithfully for over a decade, a deep unease settled in his stomach. He'd read about cases like this, seen them on the news, but never imagined he'd be living one. The system would sort this out, he tried to convince himself. It had to. Looking back through the rear window, he watched his school disappear from view. His students would be scared, confused. He hoped his colleague in the music department would keep the choir going, keep them focused on the music. They couldn't let this derail their progress, their passion. What he didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. His unwavering faith in justice, in the system, was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. But even in his darkest moments, the music would never leave him. It would become his salvation, his weapon, and ultimately, his path to redemption. The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the gray winter sky. Inside, the air felt heavy with tension as the trial entered its 3rd day. The music teacher sat beside his court-appointed lawyer, wearing his only suit, the same one he'd worn to countless school concerts and parent meetings. His mother sat in the front row, her hands clutching a worn handkerchief. She hadn't missed a single day of the trial, despite her arthritis making every journey painful. Behind her sat rows of his students' parents, fellow teachers, and even some former students who'd taken time off college to show their support. The evidence seemed overwhelmingly in his favor. More than 30 people testified that he was conducting the school concert at the exact time of the robbery. There were videos of the performance, photographs of him on stage, even a local newspaper article about the event. His lawyer presented all of this, but somehow it felt rushed, incomplete. The prosecution painted a different picture. They had an eyewitness, the store clerk who'd been working that night. The clerk sat on the stand, pointing at the teacher with shaking fingers. "I'm sure it was him," they said, despite admitting the store's security lights had been malfunctioning that night, casting strange shadows. During a break in proceedings, his lawyer whispered nervously, shuffling through papers with coffee-stained fingers. "Look," the lawyer said, "they're offering a deal. 5 years instead of 15. Maybe we should consider it." The teacher stared back in disbelief. Take a plea for a crime he didn't commit? The very thought made him stick to his stomach. Back in the courtroom, character witnesses spoke of his dedication to his students, his volunteer work with youth choirs, his spotless record. His department head talked about his perfect attendance and the way he transformed the school's music program. A student's parent cried while describing how he paid for her daughter's sheet music when they couldn't afford it. But something strange was happening. The prosecution seemed to be focusing on a grainy image from a security camera near the store. In the photo, someone tall was entering the store, face obscured by a hood. Similar build, they kept saying, though the figure could have been anyone of the same height. His lawyer struggled to challenge the evidence effectively. Questions about the lighting conditions went unasked. The fact that the store's cameras weren't working that night somehow didn't raise any red flags. The teacher wanted to speak up, to point out these oversights, but his lawyer advised him to stay quiet. The jury looked tired. The case had dragged on, becoming more complex with each passing day. They'd seen dozens of witnesses, heard conflicting testimonies, and sat through hours of technical discussions about lighting angles and photo enhancement. Some of them seemed to be barely paying attention anymore. When it came time for final arguments, the prosecutor spoke with fierce conviction of public safety and the need for justice. His own lawyer's closing statement felt weak in comparison, filled with hesitation and qualifying statements. The teacher's heart sank as he watched the jury's faces. The deliberation took less than 4 hours. Back in the courtroom, he could feel his mother's hand squeezing his shoulder. His students had made small signs reading "Free Our Teacher," but weren't allowed to bring them inside. He could see them through the windows, standing in the cold, waiting. The jury foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in their hands. The word "guilty" echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. His mother's quiet sob cut through the sudden silence. Someone in the back of the courtroom shouted no. It sounded like one of his senior students. 15 years. The sentence fell like a hammer blow. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, the teacher stood tall, his dignity intact even as his world crumbled. He turned to look at his mother, trying to convey strength he didn't feel. "It'll be okay," he mouthed to her, though he had no idea how. As they led him away, he could hear his students singing in the hallway, the same song they'd performed at the concert the night of the robbery. Their voices followed him down the corridor, a reminder of everything he was leaving behind and everything he had to fight to get back. Prison walls have a way of making time stand still. The once respected music teacher quickly learned that each day followed the same gray routine. Wake up at 6 a.m. to the harsh buzzing of bells, breakfast at 6:30, yard time, work detail, dinner, and then back to the cell. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. But he refused to let the system break his spirit. While other inmates spent their free time watching TV or playing cards, he started humming quietly to himself in his cell. The melodies were his way of holding onto who he really was, not inmate number 27,149, but a teacher, a musician, someone who had touched lives. One day during yard time, Another inmate heard him singing softly. "Hey, man, you've got a good voice," he said. Soon, a small group would gather near the basketball court to listen. The guards were suspicious at first, but they noticed how the singing seemed to calm even the most troubled inmates. With permission from a sympathetic corrections officer, he started a small choir. They met in the prison chapel twice a week. At first, only 5 inmates showed up. Some couldn't read music, others had never sung before. But he taught them the same way he taught his high school students, with patience, respect, and unwavering encouragement. "Music is freedom," he would tell them. "They can lock up our bodies, but they can't lock up our voices." The choir grew to 15 members, then 30. Men who'd never spoken to each other because of gang rivalries found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, learning to harmonize. Between choir sessions, he spent hours in the prison library, teaching himself about law. He wrote letters to civil rights organizations, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen. Most went unanswered, but he kept writing. His mother visited every Sunday, bringing news from outside and updates about her efforts to find someone to take his case. The choir's reputation grew within the prison. Even the warden, a stern woman who rarely showed emotion, would sometimes stand in the doorway during practice, listening. For Christmas, they got permission to perform for other inmates and staff. The chapel was packed that day, and when the choir sang "Amazing Grace," there wasn't a dry eye in the room. But prison life wasn't always about these small victories. He witnessed fights, dealt with threats, and faced the daily indignities of incarceration. Some nights, lying on his thin mattress, listening to the echoes of anger and despair bouncing off the concrete walls, he'd question whether he could maintain his hope. Then he'd think about his students. He received letters from them regularly. They wrote about continuing their music studies, about keeping his choir program alive at school. One former student had even decided to become a music teacher because of him. These letters became his lifeline, reminding him of who he was beyond these walls. During his second year inside, something unexpected happened. Word spread that some of his former students, now in college, had started an online campaign about his case. They'd made a documentary for their film class, interviewing people who'd been at the concert the night of the robbery. The video was gaining attention on social media. His mother brought him a transcript of the comments people were leaving online. "We believe in you," they wrote. "We haven't forgotten." Reading these messages in his cell at night, he felt less alone. The justice system might have failed him, but there were still people fighting for the truth. In the prison classroom where the choir practiced, he started teaching music theory to anyone interested in learning. Some inmates began to write their own songs, expressing their hopes and regrets through music. The choir became known for these original compositions, songs about redemption, forgiveness, and the dream of freedom. Every night before lights out, he would stand by his cell window, looking at the sliver of sky visible between the bars. He'd think about his classroom, his students, his mother getting older while he sat behind these walls. But then he'd hear someone down the block humming one of their choir songs, and he'd smile, knowing that even here, he was still teaching, still making a difference. What he didn't know then was that while he was transforming lives inside these walls, someone on the outside was about to uncover evidence that would change everything. But for now, he kept singing, kept teaching, kept hoping. Because sometimes hope and harmony are all we have. Hope often comes from unexpected places. On a rainy Tuesday morning, a young law student was sorting through old case files in the basement of the city courthouse. She'd been interning with the Innocence Project for just 2 weeks, staying late every night, driven by a belief that somewhere in these dusty boxes, someone's freedom was waiting to be discovered. That morning, something about the music teacher's case caught her eye. Perhaps it was the number of character witnesses, or the strange contrast between his spotless record and the sudden violent crime. She began digging deeper, spending her lunch breaks reading through trial transcripts. The more she read, the more things didn't add up. How had nobody noticed that there was a bank across the street from the convenience store? Banks usually have better security cameras than small stores. Following her instinct, she walked to the bank one afternoon after work. The bank manager was hesitant at first, but when she explained what she was looking for, his expression changed. "We keep our external security footage for 3 years," he said. "Nobody ever asked us about that night." Her hands trembled as they reviewed the footage from 2 years ago. There it was, clear as day. The bank's high-definition cameras had captured the convenience store entrance at exactly 8:30 p.m., the time of the robbery. The footage showed someone entering the store, but this person was noticeably shorter than the music teacher, with a completely different walking style. But that wasn't all. Using modern facial recognition software, experts could now analyze the grainy image that had been used in court. The technology didn't exist 2 years ago, but now it could definitively prove that the person in the footage couldn't possibly be the imprisoned teacher. She brought her findings to her supervisor, her voice shaking with excitement. "This is what we've been waiting for," the supervisor said, quickly assembling a team of experienced attorneys. They worked late into the night, ordering pizza and coffee, building a case that would finally bring justice. Meanwhile, in prison, the music teacher was leading his choir through a new piece they'd been practicing. He had no idea that at that very moment, a team of lawyers was preparing papers that could set him free. His mother hadn't told him about the law student's discovery yet. She'd learned from past disappointments not to raise his hopes too soon. The investigation expanded rapidly. The law student tracked down the original store clerk who had testified. 2 years had passed, and the clerk had been carrying a heavy burden. In a tearful interview, they admitted to being pressured by police to make a positive identification, despite their uncertainty. More evidence emerged. A traffic camera 2 blocks away had captured the real robber's car leaving the scene. The footage had never been requested during the original trial. The law student found it buried in the police archives, right where it had been sitting for 2 years while an innocent man lost his freedom. The team discovered that the original defense lawyer had been handling 3 other major cases that week. He'd been overwhelmed, missing crucial evidence, and failing to follow up on important leads. It wasn't just incompetence. It was a system that often provided overworked public defenders to those who couldn't afford private attorneys. As the evidence mounted, local news stations began picking up the story. The law student's discovery had sparked a larger conversation about wrongful convictions and the importance of reviewing old cases with new technology. Other lawyers began reviewing similar cases, wondering how many other innocent people might be sitting in cells. The music teacher's former students, who had never stopped believing in him, organized rallies outside the courthouse. They sang the songs he had taught them, their voices carrying a message of hope and justice. The law student attended one of these rallies, watching quietly from the back, amazed at how many lives this one man had touched. Finally, after weeks of preparation, the legal team was ready to present their findings to the court. The music teacher's mother sat in his cell with him, holding his hands as she finally told him the news. For the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to truly hope. The system that had failed him might finally set things right. What nobody knew yet was that the biggest surprise was still to come. A moment in court that would move not just the judge, but the entire nation to tears. The Innocence Project office buzzed with determined energy. A team of 5 attorneys, all working pro bono, had taken over the conference room. Papers covered every surface, sticky notes dotted the walls, and empty coffee cups told the story of countless late nights. They weren't just preparing a legal case. They were fighting to give a man his life back. The young law student who discovered the new evidence had become an essential part of the team. She'd postponed her summer plans, pouring every ounce of energy into the case. Sometimes justice needs a fresh pair of eyes, the lead attorney told her, recognizing how her determination had cracked open what seemed like a closed case. They faced an uphill battle. The legal system doesn't easily admit its mistakes. Prosecutors initially resisted, claiming the new evidence wasn't strong enough to warrant reopening the case. But the team had built something powerful, a mountain of proof that couldn't be ignored. The bank's security footage became their strongest weapon. Enhanced and analyzed by top experts, it clearly showed someone 6 inches shorter than the teacher entering the store. The footage also captured something crucial. The real perpetrator had a distinctive limp, while the teacher's walking style was completely different. More revelations emerged during their investigation. The original eyewitness, the store clerk, finally broke down during a formal interview. "I was never completely sure," they admitted, tears streaming down their face. "But the police kept showing me his photo, telling me this had to be the guy. I was young and scared. I just wanted to do the right thing." The team discovered that critical evidence had been suppressed during the original trial. The police had received tips about another suspect, someone with a history of similar robberies in the area. These leads were never followed up, never shared with the defense. It was a textbook case of tunnel vision, where investigators focused only on evidence that fit their initial theory. The teacher's mother became a regular presence in their office. She brought home-cooked meals, refusing to let them survive on just coffee and takeout. "You're fighting for my son," she'd say, her voice thick with emotion. "The least I can do is make sure you're eating properly." Her quiet strength inspired them to work even harder. They found the original detective who'd led the investigation. Now retired, he agreed to review the new evidence. His hands shook as he watched the enhanced security footage. "We got it wrong," he admitted finally. "I've carried this doubt for 2 years. I should have dug deeper." His testimony would prove crucial in court. The public defender who had handled the original case provided a sworn affidavit. He admitted to being overwhelmed, handling over 200 cases that year. "I couldn't give this case the attention it deserved," he wrote. "The system is broken. We're failing the people we're supposed to protect." Media interest grew as word of the case spread. Local news stations ran special reports about wrongful convictions. The teacher's story became a symbol of a larger problem. How many other innocent people might be sitting in cells, waiting for someone to look at their cases with fresh eyes? The prison choir members wrote letters supporting their conductor. These letters painted a powerful picture of a man who had refused to let bitterness consume him, who had instead chosen to bring light into one of the darkest places. The legal team added these letters to their filing. Evidence of character that couldn't be ignored. As they prepared for court, they received unexpected support. The original trial judge, after reviewing their evidence, took the unusual step of writing a letter supporting their motion. "Justice requires us to correct our mistakes," the judge wrote, "no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that might be." Finally, after 3 months of intense preparation, they were ready. The motion for a new hearing filled 15 boxes: evidence folders, expert testimonies, affidavits, and most importantly, the truth that had been buried for 2 years. They filed everything with the court on a Friday afternoon. What they didn't know then was that their careful preparation would set the stage for one of the most remarkable moments ever witnessed in that courthouse. The teacher had a plan of his own, something that would touch hearts and change lives far beyond those courtroom walls. The morning of the appeal hearing arrived with a mix of sunshine and nervous energy. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters, former students, and news crews. Inside, the historic courtroom's wooden benches filled quickly. Some people had arrived 2 hours early just to get a seat. The music teacher's mother made her way slowly through the crowd, leaning on her walker. People respectfully parted to let her through. She wore her Sunday best, the same outfit she'd worn to all her son's school concerts. Her face showed the strain of 2 long years, but her eyes sparkled with hope. When they brought him in, wearing prison orange instead of his familiar suit and tie, a collective gasp went through the room. He looked thinner, grayer, but carried himself with the same dignity his students remembered. He managed a small smile at his mother, then sat quietly beside his new legal team. The lead attorney began by presenting the new evidence. Her voice remained steady as she showed the enhanced security footage on a large screen. The difference between the real robber and the teacher was striking, like comparing two completely different people. Even the prosecution team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The retired detective's testimony came next. His voice cracked as he described how the investigation had gone wrong. "We were under pressure to solve the case quickly," he admitted. "We saw what we wanted to see instead of what was actually there." His honesty seemed to touch everyone in the room. Then came the store clerk, the key witness from the original trial. Now older and visibly nervous, they approached the stand. "I made a terrible mistake," they said, wiping away tears. "I was never completely sure, but I felt pressured to be certain. I've had nightmares about this for 2 years." The young law student who had discovered the crucial evidence sat in the front row, clutching a folder of documents she wouldn't need. Everything had been meticulously prepared, every detail accounted for. She watched the judge's face carefully, looking for any sign of which way things might go. During the lunch break, the prison choir members who'd been granted permission to attend gathered in a corner of the courthouse hallway. They hummed quietly, the same songs their teacher had taught them behind bars. The sound drifted through the building, a reminder of how music can bring light to the darkest places. The prosecution's case began to crumble as the afternoon wore on. Faced with overwhelming evidence of innocence, they finally did something unexpected. The lead prosecutor stood up and formally requested that all charges be dropped. "In light of the new evidence," he said, "continuing this prosecution would be a miscarriage of justice." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge, the same one who had sentenced him 2 years ago, removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. The weight of the moment, of correcting a terrible wrong, seemed to settle on everyone's shoulders. Then came the moment for the teacher to speak. He rose slowly, and those who knew him well noticed him take the same deep breath he used to take before conducting his choir. Nobody could have predicted what would happen next, a moment that would soon go viral and touch millions of hearts. His former students in the gallery leaned forward. His mother gripped her walker tighter. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, turned to watch. The man who had spent 2 years wrongfully imprisoned was about to do something that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in that courtroom. The judge gave him permission to step away from the defendant's table. He moved to the center of the courtroom, standing in a shaft of sunlight from the high windows. The room fell completely silent, waiting. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. A moment of such pure humanity that it transcended the usual boundaries of court proceedings. This man, who had every right to be angry, who had lost 2 years of his life to a broken system, was about to demonstrate the true meaning of grace and forgiveness in a way that would leave not a dry eye in the house. Standing in the center of the courtroom, the teacher's presence seemed to fill the entire space. Without saying a word, he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. Everyone waited, wondering what he would say to the system that had taken 2 years of his life. Instead of speaking, he began to sing. The first notes of Amazing Grace floated through the air, his rich voice carrying years of pain and hope in every word. The sound was pure, powerful, and completely unexpected in this formal setting. People later said they could actually feel the vibrations of his voice in their hearts. The bailiff, who had started to move forward to stop this unusual display, froze in place. The judge made no move to interrupt. At first, the teacher sang alone, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Then, one by one, his former students in the gallery joined in, their voices harmonizing just as he had taught them. His mother's trembling soprano added to the chorus. Then the prison choir members, scattered throughout the courtroom, stood and joined the song. Even people who didn't know the words found themselves humming along. The courthouse had never heard anything like it. The store clerk who had mistakenly identified him began to weep openly. The retired detective bowed his head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The young law student who had discovered the evidence that freed him sat transfixed, watching justice take a form she'd never imagined in law school. When they reached the line, "I once was lost, But now and found, the judge removed her glasses, wiping her eyes with a tissue. The prosecutor, who had fought so hard to keep this man in prison, had to turn away to hide his emotion. This wasn't just a song. It was a message about forgiveness, about the power of the human spirit to rise above injustice. As the last notes faded away, the teacher opened his eyes. "Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice still musical even when speaking. "I could stand here and talk about anger, about the system that failed me, about the 2 years I lost." He paused, looking around the courtroom. "But instead," he continued, "I want to talk about what I found. In prison, I met men who had never heard a kind word, never believed they could create something beautiful. We made music together. We found humanity in a place designed to take it away. I'm not angry. I'm grateful for the lives I was able to touch, even behind those walls." The judge, still visibly moved, had to take a moment to compose herself. The teacher's next words stunned everyone. "I'd forgive everyone involved in my wrongful conviction," he said. "We're all human. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them, how we learn from them, how we move forward." He turned to face the store clerk who had misidentified him. "I forgive you," he said gently. "You were scared and uncertain, and you did what you thought was right at the time. Carry no more guilt." The clerk sobbed harder, decades of tension releasing in that moment. To the original detective, "I forgive you too. Pressure to solve cases quickly shouldn't come at the cost of justice, but I understand you were doing your job as best you could." The retired officer nodded, unable to speak through his tears. Finally, he turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I don't ask for anything except the chance to return to my classroom, to my students, to my music. The world needs more harmony, not more discord. Let my story be about redemption, not retribution." The courtroom erupted in applause, something that never happens in court, but the judge made no move to stop it. Even the bailiff was clapping. It was more than just a moment of emotion. It was a reminder of the power of forgiveness, the strength of the human spirit, and the healing force of music. What happened next would not just change his life, but would ripple out to affect the entire justice system in ways nobody could have predicted that day. When the applause finally died down, the judge took several deep breaths to steady herself. The entire courtroom waited in pin-drop silence. She looked down at her papers, then removed her reading glasses and looked directly at the teacher who had just moved an entire courtroom to tears. "In my 30 years on the bench," she began, her voice carrying unusual emotion, "I have never witnessed anything like what we've seen today." She paused, collecting her thoughts. This court made a terrible mistake 2 years ago. A mistake that cost an innocent man his freedom, his career, and precious time with his aging mother. She straightened in her chair, her next words ringing clear through the hushed courtroom. "The conviction is hereby overturned, effective immediately. All charges are dismissed." The words had barely left her mouth when the gallery erupted in cheers, but she wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, raising her hand for silence, "I am issuing a formal apology from this court. This was unprecedented. Judges rarely admitted to errors, let alone apologized for them. The system failed you, sir. We failed you. Your response to this failure has taught us all a profound lesson in dignity and forgiveness." The teacher's mother began to cry softly, happy tears this time. Her son was finally free. 2 of his former students rushed to help her stand as the judge continued speaking. "But an apology isn't enough," the judge declared. "I am ordering a complete review of all similar cases from the past 5 years. We must ensure this never happens to another innocent person." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I'm also recommending changes to our eyewitness identification procedures and evidence disclosure requirements." The young law student who had discovered the crucial evidence couldn't hold back her own tears. Her supervisor squeezed her shoulder. This victory would change lives far beyond this one case. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who stepped forward with a key. The handcuffs that had bound the teacher's wrists fell away with a final click. For the first time in 2 years, he was truly free. His first steps as a free man took him straight to his mother. Their embrace brought fresh tears to everyone's eyes. "My boy," she whispered, touching his face. "My beautiful boy." The prison choir members, still present in the gallery, began humming softly, a melody he had taught them. The prosecutor, who had fought against this outcome for so long, approached with an outstretched hand. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I am so sorry." The teacher accepted his handshake without hesitation, demonstrating once again the forgiveness he had just sung about. Reporters pressed forward, cameras flashing, but they couldn't penetrate the circle of love that had formed around him. His former students, now young adults, surrounded him protectively. Some were already planning his return to school, talking about decorating his classroom and organizing a welcome-back concert. The judge made one final announcement before leaving the bench. "Let the record show," she said, her voice carrying clearly above the emotional murmurs, "that this case will be used to train future lawyers and judges. Not just about the importance of evidence, but about the power of forgiveness and the true meaning of justice." Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun seemed brighter somehow. A crowd had gathered, holding signs and singing the school's alma mater. News cameras captured the moment as he stepped into the sunlight, blinking at his first taste of true freedom in 2 years. But even in this moment of triumph, his thoughts were already turning to the future, to the changes he could help bring about, to the lives he could touch, and to the music he would continue to share with the world. His story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The media would soon share his story across the nation, sparking important conversations about justice reform. But more importantly, his example of grace under pressure would inspire countless others to find their own strength in forgiveness. 6 months after his release, the high school auditorium was packed to overflowing. Students, parents, and community members sat shoulder to shoulder, while others stood along the walls. They had all come to witness something special, the teacher's first concert since regaining his freedom. The stage looked different now. Behind the usual rows of choir risers stood 20 men in suits, former prison choir members who had since been released. They had traveled from different states to be here, each one carrying a story of how music had changed their life behind bars. The teacher stood at the conductor's podium, looking much like he had before his ordeal, except for a new wisdom in his eyes and touches of gray at his temples. As he raised his hands, the auditorium fell silent. What followed was unlike anything the school had ever heard. A powerful blend of voices from his current students and his prison choir, singing about hope, redemption, and second chances. But his work wasn't confined to music anymore. He had started a foundation to help wrongfully convicted people rebuild their lives after release. Every week, he visited prisons across the state, establishing music programs. "Music breaks down walls," he would say. "It helps us remember our humanity." The young law student who had discovered the evidence that freed him now ran the legal department of his foundation. Together, they had already helped overturn 3 more wrongful convictions. Each success strengthened their resolve to fix the broken parts of the justice system. His story became a catalyst for change. The state legislature passed a bill requiring all police departments to update their eyewitness identification procedures. They named it after him, a permanent reminder of how one man's dignity in the face of injustice could drive meaningful reform. The prison where he had spent 2 years transformed its rehabilitation programs. The choir he had started there continued to grow, now led by one of his former choir members who was serving a longer sentence. They performed for other prisons, spreading the message that change is possible, that hope can survive even in the darkest places. His mother, though older now, never missed a concert. She sat in the front row, beaming with pride not just at her son's music, but at how he had turned his pain into purpose. The walker she had used at the courthouse was replaced by a comfortable chair reserved specially for her. The store clerk who had mistakenly identified him became an advocate against rush-to-judgment prosecutions. They traveled together sometimes, sharing their story as a powerful example of how mistakes can happen and how forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. His former students, inspired by his example, pursued careers in law, social work, and criminal justice reform. "He taught us more than music," one of them said during a television interview. "He taught us about grace, about standing up after life knocks you down, about using your voice for something bigger than yourself." The judge who had freed him kept her word about systemic change. She established a review board to examine questionable convictions and pushed for better funding for public defenders. Every time she swore in new lawyers, she told them his story as a reminder of their responsibility to seek truth, not just victories. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes sit at his piano at home, playing softly and reflecting on his journey. The bitterness that could have consumed him had instead become a force for good. His mother would often find him there, lost in thought and music. "Do you ever regret forgiving them?" she asked him once. He shook his head, his fingers still moving over the keys. "Forgiveness freed me long before that courtroom did," he replied. "Besides, look at all the good that's come from it." Sometimes our worst moments become our most important turning points. As his story spread, letters poured in from around the world. People shared their own struggles, their own journeys toward forgiveness. He answered every letter, often including sheet music. Simple songs of hope that could be sung anywhere by anyone. The teacher who had lost 2 years of his life had gained something precious, a deeper purpose. His music now carried a message more powerful than ever before, that justice, mercy, and grace could exist together, that one person's choice to forgive could ripple out to change countless lives. His story wasn't just about wrongful conviction and freedom anymore. It had become a symphony of hope, a testimony to the power of the human spirit, and a reminder that even the darkest experiences can be transformed into light for others.